looking first of all at some characteristics of the book of Deuteronomy, because that's our new book that we're going to start in this evening. First of all, it forms the conclusion to the Pentateuch. We've looked at the first four books, Deuteronomy the fifth and final book. So one characteristic that's unique of Deuteronomy is that it closes out the Pentateuch. We couldn't have had Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers fulfill this position here. None of them would fit, but Deuteronomy, on the basis of its content and purpose, is just the book we need to close out the Pentateuch. Secondly, it is Moses' farewell address to the people. Thirdly, it is a militaristic book, more so than any of the other books in the Pentateuch, where we see the command to go in and possess the land, repeated time and time again in Deuteronomy. As a matter of fact, we see it over 50 times that they're to go in and possess the land and possess their possessions that God has promised through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's a militaristic book, preparing them for their military exploits that we'll see in the book of Joshua. Joshua leading in the people under the direction, chapter 5 of Joshua, the captain of the hosts of the Lord, the angel of the covenant of the Older Testament. And they're going to lead, he and the angel of the covenant are leading the people in to take the land. Fourthly, these are all characteristics of the book. It is a hortatory book, made up primarily of inspirational exhortations. Hortatory. H-O-R-T-A-T-O-R-Y. Hortatory book. Look it up in the dictionary. It's the best word to describe Deuteronomy in its nature. It's a hortatory book. Fifthly, it's made up chiefly of 3 sermons, which we see Moses preaching to the people. Of course, that means that there are hortatory sermons. We see very little physical action taking place here. It's comparable in that regard to Leviticus, because in Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, you have a lot of action taking place. In Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, very little action. Mostly a lot of talking, a lot of preaching. In Leviticus, God revealing a lot of things to Moses and to Aaron, and then they going and carrying it on to the people. Deuteronomy, it's Moses the one doing the talking, not God revealing anything. Moses is the one, and this whole book is centered around these 3 sermons that he gives. And that's what makes up pretty much the whole book, except for the very beginning and the very end. Sixthly, the whole book takes place in a little over a month in the plains of Moab on the east side of the Jordan River, which we see in chapter 1 and verse 5, or verses 3 to 5, I guess I should say. Chapter 5, or verse 5 of chapter 1, you see where they're located on the east side of Jordan in Moab. Verse 3 of chapter 1 lets you know that we're in the 40th year, the 11th month, the first day of the month. And this is where it begins. By the time we get over to Joshua, we're over into the 41st year. So, and it's at the very beginning of the year also, the very first month of the 41st year, which means we've only got a month to go between the beginning of Deuteronomy, or a little over a month probably, the beginning of Deuteronomy over to the beginning of Joshua. Seventhly, probably like no other book in the Old Testament, its one overall theme is the theme of obedience. So you can remember it's a book teaching you to obey God and to obey His laws and His commandments. Another primary theme that we see in the book is the theme of love. Love toward God and God's love toward His people. one of, I guess you could say, 3 Old Testament books that has as its theme, or a theme in it, the theme of love. One of 3 books. What are the other 2 Old Testament books that have as their theme? Song of Solomon. What's the other one? Old Testament books that have as a theme, or the theme, a theme, love. Song of Solomon, Deuteronomy, there's one other book. No one knows loud enough to speak it out. Hosea. Hosea is called the prophet of love in the Older Testament. Hosea, Deuteronomy, and the Psalms dealing with love. Because as Jesus said, remember over there in John 14 and verse 21, if you love him, then you'll obey him. So you can see how love and obedience would go together here in Deuteronomy. Same thing is true in Hosea, same thing's true in the Psalms. Teaching on obedience, teaching on love. If you love, you'll obey. If you're obeying, then it's proof that you do indeed love. Another characteristic, the teachings in Deuteronomy constitute Jesus' sword against Satan in his temptation in the wilderness, in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. And I'll show you these places. First of all, if you'll turn over to chapter 8 of Deuteronomy. See how Jesus used the teachings of Deuteronomy as his sword to combat the devil and his temptation in the wilderness, Matthew 4 and Luke 4. You'll see the context where he gave these famous quotations that probably you know better from Matthew 4 than you do from Luke 4. Different order than in Matthew and Luke, but one of them's giving them in direct order and one of them's not. Deuteronomy 8 and verse 3. Here's one of the places. Jesus knew his Old Testament. And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. So Deuteronomy 8:3, one of the places that Jesus knew from the Old Testament that he could quote against the devil. Then the other 2 are back in chapter 6. Well, I don't want to spend the time on looking on both of those. So I'll let you look those up. Just get that down that Jesus, just a side comment here as a characteristic, that Jesus is using Deuteronomy as the sword. Then a final characteristic, which is interesting because of other things that we've looked at, is that we find in Deuteronomy, most of the time when Moses is referring back to the Mount of God, he's referring to it by its name Horeb rather than by its name Sinai. That's just something that's peculiar about the book of Deuteronomy. Such as in chapter 1 and verse 6, says, the Lord our God spake unto us in Horeb. Time and time again when he's going back and referring to the mount, you see him referring back to Horeb rather than to Sinai. There is an exception over in chapter 33. Let's see, 33 and verse 2. Here we do see an exception. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai, rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran. He came with 10,000s of his saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. So there you see an exception. Chapter 33 and verse 2. Where he does use the name Sinai rather than the name Horeb. But for the most part, as you go throughout Deuteronomy, you'll see that he's always referring to it as Horeb rather than to Mount Sinai. So those are some characteristics of the book. All the books of the Bible have their own certain peculiar characteristics that set them apart from other books in the Bible. Now let me give you an outline. And this outline, of course, is based on Moses' 3 sermons. That's what we have to base our outline on, because that's how the book has been divided. So for an outline, we have 4 parts. Chapters 1 through 4, which is what we're going to look at this evening. We have a historical review of God's guidance from Horeb, or Sinai, to Moab. See, Moses is standing now preaching all this to them. So he's reviewing, giving them a historical review of the journeys that Israel took from Horeb or Sinai to the land of Moab, east of the Jordan River. 5 through 26, we have a legal discourse concerning many of the earlier and former laws that they had been given in Exodus through Numbers. A legal discourse concerning earlier laws, 5 through 26, which you see is the heart of Deuteronomy. 5 through 26 makes up the middle of the book there. So the heart of it is a legal discourse. Chapters 27 through 30, we have the formal ratification of the law. The formal ratification of the law. 31 through 34, historical appendices, which contains Moses' farewell to the people and his final words. So we will look at them more or less in this order. We'll look at chapters 1 to 4 tonight, the historical review of the journeys of Israel. And then probably we'll look at 5 through 26, the legal discourse, which is the heart of Deuteronomy. And then 27 through 34, which makes up Moses' final sermon, which has the ratification of the law and the twofold historical appendices that concludes the book of Deuteronomy. The name of the book. Now we're putting this up so you can get all the names down in Hebrew. You can put both of them down on Deuteronomy. Well, I'll go up a little bit higher to begin with so you can get the one on Deuteronomy. Elahadavarim is the most important one to remember. These are the words. That's the one that we will remember it by. Elahadavarim. These are the words. Again, these 5 books in the Pentateuch are taken, the names for these 5 books in the Pentateuch, taken from the first word or few words in the book. Most of the other books, the name of it, of course, is taken by the most important figure in it, or the author of the book. All your prophets, it's the author of the book. Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Of course, Samuel dies there in the end of 1st Samuel, so we know Samuel couldn't have written 2nd Samuel. But he's the chief character that starts off this whole scene in the beginning of 1 Samuel. So, again, those you see that the names are taken from the characters themselves. But here in the Pentateuch, the Jews have always taken the name for their book from the first word or the first few words there. Deuteronomy Elahadavarim. The other name that it's known by is Mishnah Hadara, which means the repetition of the law. You got the bottom ones there? Can I drop it down so you can get the top ones? Not yet. Elahadavarim Mishnah Hadara. Just gave you the one name there on Numbers. We didn't give you the midbar there in the wilderness, because this is the basic one. Way at Haber there in Numbers. Wayikra, Leviticus, Exodus, Waelish, Shema. On the bottom there for Deuteronomy? Yeah, right. 2 Hebrew names. The points there are Hebrew. The English letters are the transliteration of the Hebrew. Repetition of the law. Repetition. I'll show you that from over in chapter 17. That's where we get our name for the book, by the way. We don't get ours from the Elahadavarim. We get ours from the Mishnah Hadara. Okay, I'm going to drop it down so you can see Genesis if you didn't get Genesis there. As soon as you're ready, turn over to chapter 17 then. The LXX and the Vulgate both have gotten their name from chapter 17. Verses 17 through 19. And we've taken our name from the LXX and from the Vulgate. Deuteronomy. I mean, you wouldn't have even known what that meant. What in the world does Deuteronomy mean? You're learning what the other ones, Genesis, Exodus, you knew that must be talking about exiting. Leviticus, the Levites, Numbers, counting, totaling, figuring up, math, arithmetic, numbers. But Deuteronomy, what type of whatever is that? It goes back to Latin. Deuteronomy 17, verses 17 to 19. Now, what the word really means here is a second law. That's what the word Deuteronomy means, a second law. But it's confusing if that's all you know it by a second law, because that sounds like the law has been given in Genesis, or we could say Exodus through Numbers, and now in Deuteronomy we're going to start with a second law from Moses. And you see, that would give you a misconcept in your mind if you thought of it as a second law. Really, it's not a second law, it's a repetition of the law. And we see the basis for this and for their word in Deuteronomy 17:17. Now, he's speaking here of the future potential of the kingship or the monarchy in Israel. You have to tie this together with what's been revealed before and what's, of course, revealed over in 1 Samuel. God's not mad at the people because they've asked for a king, remember, because he's already given legislation here in Deuteronomy 17 concerning those future kings they're going to have. And of course, that's traced all the way back to Abraham. God told him that kings will come out of thy loins. And so we know that he had in the distant future planned for the Israelite monarchy, just that they went about it in a wrong spirit is what displeased both God and the prophet Samuel. So here he's talking about the future kings that come on the scene in the Israelite monarchy. Neither shall he multiply, so that he is speaking of the kings. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself. And you know almost all the kings had more than one wife. Even David did. So you see this is in direct violation to Deuteronomy 17:17. Even King David was missing it there. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself. That is heart. Turn not away. You can look over in 1 Kings 11 and Solomon and see a good example of that scripture being fulfilled. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. Now, God was going to bless the nation, and the temple was a very elaborate structure here, but he warned the king about he could have silver and gold. He said, don't multiply silver and gold. Don't get too much of it, because God knew what that would do. And it shall be when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom that he shall write him a copy of this law. He shall write Deuteronomy in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. In other words, a repetition of the law. This is what the king wants to do so that he could study it out. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes to do them. So that's where we see the origin of the word, Deuteronomy 17 and verse 18. Happens to mention there a copy of the law that the king, that's not even referring to this book, Deuteronomy. It's talking about a copy the king was to make himself to study. Of course, of the whole Pentateuch here, that he was to study. And so your people that ended up naming the book Deuteronomy saw a parallel between what the king was supposed to do and what Deuteronomy really is. It is a copy of Exodus through Numbers, or a repetition, or a second law. Repetition's the best word to remember, because it's just repeating a lot that's been said earlier. There are additions that are placed in there. But that's because Moses is speaking here by inspiration. So there are things added in. One of the most notable things, if you read Deuteronomy 5 and look at the Ten Commandments there, they're quite a bit different from Exodus chapter 20. And they've caused many, many problems in people's theologians' minds and their books and bookshelves. But if you put both of them together, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, then it'll make a lot of sense. Who's the author? Well, Moses. Let me give you some verses to prove that Moses is the author. 1 and 5, 5 and 1, 27 1, 27 9, 27 11, 29 1, 31 1, and 24 to 26. Let's go over some of these and look at them. Then I've got one more to give you. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 5. On this side Jordan, in the land of Moab, began Moses to declare this law, saying. I mean, that's kind of the heading for the whole book. Moses is declaring, and it says this law. It's the law that's already been given. But he's going to repeat some of it, add some things in where he thinks necessary, and that's why we know that it's a hortatory book. Chapter 5 and verse 1. Which, of course, is the beginning of the second sermon, as you see from your outline. Moses called all Israel and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that ye may learn them and keep them and do them. So we see Moses, the author, again. Chapter 29 and verse 1. Which is in the middle here of the final section. These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, beside the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Now we see several things here. It says that these are the words. By the way, that goes back to chapter 1 and verse 1. Elahad Avarim, these are the words. Chapter 1 and verse 1, these are the words. So he's referring to everything that's been said from 1:1 to 29:1. To show again that Moses is the composer and compiler of all of this. Again in this verse, we see him calling the name of the mountain what? Horeb, not Sinai. And it says that this is the law beside the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Now it sounds like an additional second law, but that's not what he means. He only means that it's another one beside the first one, because Moses does add a lot of things to Deuteronomy that we don't find anywhere else in the Pentateuch. Then in chapter 31, verse 1, Moses went and spake these words unto all Israel. Verses 24 to 26. And it came to pass, when Moses made an end of writing the words of this law in a book, until they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, Take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. Because he knew they would turn away from it in the future. And then to give you a New Testament passage to prove that this is the work of Moses, go back to Deuteronomy 18 and verse 18. This famous passage in Deuteronomy 18. Verse 18. This is Moses speaking, and he says, I will raise them up. Now he's speaking on behalf of the Lord. Verse 15, the Lord God will raise up unto thee a prophet. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee. God speaking of Moses. But Moses is the one giving the words to the people. And will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. This is known as the Deuteronomy prophet here. We see that Deuteronomy prophet over in Acts 3 and verse 22. Acts 3 and verse 22. Moses is the one speaking, or God's the one actually doing the speaking here to Moses, first of all, and he's saying, I'm going to raise up to the people in the future a prophet that is like you. In other words, like Moses. And this prophet, we're told, if you look over in Acts 3, in verse 22, For Moses truly said unto the fathers. All right, so he's attributing Deuteronomy 18. This is the Apostle Peter, and he's attributing Deuteronomy 18 to Moses. Moses truly said unto the fathers, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed from among the people. Yea, and all the prophets from Samuel and those that follow after, as many as have spoken, have likewise foretold of these days. Ye are the children of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with our fathers, saying unto Abraham, And in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. Unto you first God having raised up. You see verse 22, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up. So here's the prophet in verse 26. Unto you first God having raised up his Son Jesus, sent him to bless you in turning away every one of you from his iniquity. So obviously Christ is the Deuteronomy prophet that was spoken of in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 18 by Moses, that God said would be comparable unto Moses. We see demonstrations of that back in Numbers, especially the Korah account in Numbers 16, where they didn't obey Moses, then they were destroyed. That brings us to the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy. Yes. For Moses being the author, okay. 1:5, 5:1, 18:18 with Acts 3:22. 27:1, 9, 11, 29:1, 31:1, and 24 to 26. Oh, I never gave you your memory scripture, did I? That's chapter 10, verses 12 to 13. We just turn over there and look at it. It's two precious verses. Deuteronomy 10, 12 to 13. Maybe some of you already have it memorized. This is very interesting here. I always tack verse 14 on because it sounds good to end. But all you have to know is verses 12 to 13. Now, after I said that, I assume all of you will learn verse 14 too. And now, Israel, or church out there, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee? Well, here's what he requires. But to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens is the Lord's thy God, the earth also, with all that therein is. Repeated over in Psalm 24:1. So there's your two verses to memorize in Deuteronomy 10, 12 to 13. The purpose of the book of Deuteronomy. Someone want to take a guess at what we said so far? What's the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy? All of these books now, you got to go back through the other 4 books, and they've all got a purpose for that whole book. Okay, an exhortation to obey the laws of God once they come into the promised land. Moses knows he's not going to make it in. But the whole book of Deuteronomy, all 33 chapters, and then of course he dies in the last one, 34. All of this is an exhortation to them, to the people of Israel, to make sure that they will obey the Lord and his laws whenever they finally make it into the promised land. So that's the purpose. It exhorts the people to obey the law once they enter Canaan. I want to give you some scriptures that prove that, and I don't want you to just take these down as idle scriptures. You go home and look all these up, and you'll be amazed at what Deuteronomy says. Here's some examples just to prove that that is indeed the theme and the purpose of the whole book. Chapter 4 and verse 1. verses 5 to 10. Verse 40, chapter 5 and verse 1. Verses 32 through 33. Chapter 6, verses 1 to 2. Verse 25. 7:11. Chapter 7:11, verse 11. 8:1. 10:12 to 13. 11, verse 1. 8 to 9. Verses 18 to 22. And verse 32. Chapter 12, 1, 28, 32. Chapter 13, verse 4, verse 18. 15:5. Chapter 26, verses 16 to 19. Chapter 27, verse 1, 10, 26. Chapter 28, verse 1, verse 14. Chapter 29 and verse 9. Chapter 31, verses 11 to 13. And finally, chapter 30, we want to go look at this one, verses 10 to 20. So you look all those scriptures up, and it'll just amaze you to see that this is the book on obedience here. If you want to go anywhere with God, you've got to obey what He says. I don't know where people will get the idea that they don't have to obey God. Those are just some of the verses that I spotted in Deuteronomy. And they all practically say the same thing. You must keep His statutes, His ordinances, His commandments, His laws. And it just says it time and time and time again. Over in chapter 30, beginning in verse 10, this is similar to all those other verses that I just gave you. And if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep His commandments and His statutes which are written in this book of the law, for the continual shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep His commandments and His statutes which are written in this book of the law, and if thou turn unto the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. For this commandment which I command thee this day is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. This is what Paul quotes there in Romans 10. It is not in heaven that thou shouldest say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it down unto us, that we may hear it and do it. You see, you might never have understood what Paul was meaning there in Romans 10. When he says the word of faith is in your heart, it's not above, it's not below. So you go back here where he's quoting it from and you understand. People say, oh, that's too far off for me to obey. Just what he said here. Don't say it's up in heaven and it's too far off for me to obey. Verse 13, neither is it beyond the sea, that thou shouldest say, well, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very nigh unto thee, in thy mouth and in thy heart, that thou mayest do it. See, I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil. In that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His commandments, and His statutes and His judgments, that thou mayest live and multiply. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it. But if thine heart turn away so that thou wilt not hear, but shalt be drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, then I denounce you this day, that ye shall surely perish, and that ye shall not prolong your days upon the land whither thou passest over Jordan to possess it. By the way, in the end of verse 16 and the end of verse 18, there's that word possess that I said you'll see over 50 times. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey His voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto Him, for He is thy life and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Now, a lot of people are quoting verse 19, but you see, if you would know what all of Deuteronomy is talking about, then you can't just quote verse 19 and say, well, God says I can choose whatever I want to have. The whole book of Deuteronomy says you've got to obey God. The whole book does. That's why we're going slowly in these survey classes, so you won't take a verse like that. I mean, in all of the things that you study, if you'd understand the whole counsel of God in the background, then people wouldn't end up with the misconceptions and the heresies that they do. They wouldn't go here and say, well, doesn't this look like a good verse? He set before me life and death, blessing and cursing, and he said I can choose life, so I'm just going to choose life. Oh, I'm not going to wear my head covering, but I'm going to choose life, though. Or I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to choose life because he said I could choose life. But what did we read just back in verse 10? If thou hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God. Well, then you'll get all these things that he goes on to talk about here in the end of chapter 30. You look at all those passages there. I'd always tell the people, look at all those ones that tell you what you have to do before they'll tell you what God will do for you. Then you'll start off on a sure foot, because you'll start off on a foot obeying God. Well, that's all introduction. What time is it, someone? We got time to go into chapters 1 to 4? Okay, let's go back to chapter 1. I didn't know how long that would take us to go through the introduction, so let's go back to chapter 1 and hopefully go through chapter 4 then. Now, I've given you the outline, and we want to subdivide that first part of the outline for you now. The first part was chapters 1 to 4, the historical review of God's guidance. We want to subdivide that part of your outline. First of all, chapter 1, we have from Sinai or from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. Most of the time here in Deuteronomy, you see the whole name spelled out. In Numbers, generally you just see Kadesh. But in Deuteronomy, you always see Kadesh Barnea. Chapters 2 and 3, from Kadesh Barnea to the land of the Amorites. Then chapter 4, they're in Moab. So what we've got here in chapters 1 through 4 would correspond, if you want to go back to Numbers. Remember Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Just want to show you in these first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy, he is reviewing everything from Numbers 10 through Numbers 36. I mean, that whole 2/3, the latter 2/3 of Numbers is all reviewed and summed up in Deuteronomy 1 to 4. Because if we've got in chapter 1 from Sinai to Kadesh, chapters 2 and 3 from Kadesh to the land of the Amorites, in chapter 4 of Deuteronomy we end up in Moab. Well, let's go back to Numbers, and you should remember how that's going to correspond with Numbers chapters 10 through 36. All right, we got to begin with them in Sinai. Verse 11 of Numbers 10. And it came to pass on the 20th day of the 2nd month in the 2nd year that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony. And the children of Israel took their journeys out of the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran. That's what Moses is going to begin with, leaving Sinai. You go over to chapter 13, verse 26. We see them in Kadesh Barnea. So all of this would correspond to chapter 1 of Deuteronomy. Then we see them from this place. Of course, we know they're going to abide in Kadesh for a while. We'll see that again in Deuteronomy. To go all the way over to Numbers chapter 20, we know they're in Kadesh again, of course, or really all the way over to Numbers 21, and we see them conquering Sihon and Og. Remember, they are the king of the Amorites. So from Kadesh over to the land of the Amorites, that corresponds to Deuteronomy 2 and 3. Then Deuteronomy 4 is in Moab. Numbers 22 and verse 1 is when they finally arrive and pitch in the plains of Moab. And they stay there all the way on through chapter 36 of Numbers. Now you'll see in reading Deuteronomy that he's also going to go back at different times and pick other things out to put them in his sermons here that wouldn't fit from Numbers 10 to 36. Such as in Deuteronomy 1, 9 through 18. Now remember, there were two times, one in Exodus 18 and one in Numbers 11, whenever Moses needed help. That is, physical manpower help for some other men to help him in ruling over the people. And if you were just reading along in Deuteronomy, especially if you get down there in verses, 9 through 12, it would appear like he's talking about Numbers 11. You'd think, well, that's going to correspond back there to Numbers 11. And you might even have a cross-reference that takes you to Numbers 11, but this account happens to be referring all the way back to Exodus 18. We know that from verse 15, because no mention is made in Numbers 11 of these 70 elders being set over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens and so forth. This is what we see on the advice of Jethro back in Exodus 18. So in Deuteronomy 1:15, that would take us all the way back to Exodus 18:18. Even though he says in verse 9, and at that time, and you think he's talking about the same time in verses 6 through 8. So that's a subdivision of the first division of your outline. Chapter 1, Sinai to Kadesh. 2 and 3, Kadesh to the land of the Amorites. Chapter 4, they're in the land of Moab. Deuteronomy 1 in verse 1. We'll start here in the very beginning. These be the words, Elohadabarim, which Moses spake unto all Israel, on this side Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain over against the Red Sea, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab. Now verses 2 and 3 is a sarcastic remark that he's adding in here. You notice he puts verse 2 in parentheses, and he said, there be 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So there, he said that's an 11-day trip. And so he says in verse 3, and so it came to pass after 11 days, no, and it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month. He's being a little facetious there. He's trying to point out the reason they didn't get there in 11 days was because of their unbelief. I mean, something must have happened. And we've even had people in modern times that have doubted that, and they've gone to Mount Sinai and walked to Kadesh Barnea, and they can make it in less than 11 days, because after all, this was 3 million people. And there's only one person or two people going over there. That's walking pretty fast to make it that far, though. It really is, because you've got a long way to go from Mount Sinai or Horeb up there to Kadesh Barnea. But it's been demonstrated recently that it can be done in 11 days or in less than 11 days. So he said there's only 11 days' journey, but it took them 40 years. It came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spake unto the children of Israel according unto all that the Lord had given him in commandment unto them. After he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorites, which dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, which dwelt at Ashtaroth in Edrei, on this side Jordan in the land of Moab, began Moses to declare this law, saying, goes on, begins to declare the law. It says in verse 19 that they had to pass through what he called that great and terrible wilderness in order to get where they were going. Verse 22, we mentioned to you before, something people generally don't see, that the plan to send the 12 spies in originated with old unbelieving Israel. Moses goes on to approve of the plan in verse 23, but the intention, what he wants you to see from verse 22, is that the reason why they instituted this plan, the people dreamed this plan up, was because of fear, because of unbelief. They really didn't think God was going to give them the land. They didn't believe that God was going to give them the land. So they are the ones who said, we want to send the 12 spies into the land. Most people think God said send the 12 spies in, but they are the ones who want to send those 12 spies in and just see if everything is okay there. And when they went in, they came back in chapter 13, and sure enough, everything was not okay. And they even said that we were like grasshoppers in our sight and in their sight, compared to those sons of Anakim, a race of giants there. We're not going to read all of this because it's saying what we've seen over there in our studies in Numbers. Going on down to the end of the chapter, verse 42 through 45. Remember, this concerns whenever they decide to go presumptuously up the hill and try to take the promised land anyway. And of course, it doesn't work for them. Verse 46, Deuteronomy 1, corresponds to chapters 15 through 19 in Numbers. You've got the 38 years wandering between chapters 19 and 20 in Numbers. But after God says that you're going to have to wander for the 40 or for the 38 years in chapter 14, then we've still got all those events in 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. When did those occur? They occurred right here in verse 46. So ye abode in Kadesh many days, according unto the days that ye abode there. And it appears that this was kind of a general encampment for them, that they came back to Kadesh Barnea more than once. In chapter 2, we see them commanded not to bother three particular nations. First of all, in verses 1 to 8, the Edomites. They are the descendants of Esau. That's Genesis 36:1. Then in verses 9 through 15, we see that they're commanded to leave the Moabites alone. Verses 16 through 23, we see they're commanded to leave the Ammonites alone. Now, how far back do we have to go to find the origin of the Moabites and the Ammonites? Back to Lot. Genesis 19:37 for the Moabites, Genesis 19:38 for the Ammonites. Both of these, of course, were the two sons produced by the incestuous relationship between Lot's two daughters and himself. Moabites and Ammonites. So they are related, in other words, by blood to Abraham and the descendants of Abraham through Isaac, because Lot was Abraham's nephew. Now, what's interesting here that Moses is adding in, remember we studied this over in Numbers 20, and Moses sent the messenger over there to Mount Seir, Mount Hor, Esau, the Edomites, and of course the king says, no, I will not allow you to come in. We notice here from chapter 2 that although they did go over there, remember Moses, it took time to get the messenger back, and they did actually go all the way on over there. Verse 6, and we see this several other places, even with the other people here, Moabites and Ammonites, that even though the king of these people would not allow them to go through their land, the people came out and sold bread and food and water to the children of Israel. And that's how God happened to supply their needs. These three groups now, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, are all relatives of Israel. And the people of these three nations, these three countries, do come out and sell food to the Israelites to sustain them whenever they're going by. Verse 25 of chapter 2 is the supernatural type of fear and dread that God put upon the people. This day will I begin to put the dread of thee and the fear of thee upon the nations that are under the whole heaven. Who shall hear report of thee and shall tremble and be in anguish because of thee. And remember whenever the two spies in Joshua chapter 2 come into the city of Jericho and Rahab takes them in, and she said, we've heard of you, and she said, our hearts have melted for fear for the Israelites and what God's going to do to us through you. And we see this said many, many times more over in the book of Joshua. This fear, so it's all traced back to Deuteronomy 2:25, a supernatural fear that God places upon them. Then we have the defeat of Sihon. He's one of the kings, one of the two kings of the Amorites, in verses 24 through 37, which takes us on through the end of chapter 2. Then in chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, we have the defeat of Og, who's king of Bashan. Both of them are Amorites, but Og is a little bit north of Sihon. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. Whenever you see one of these fellows mentioned, you always see the other one. Sihon and Og. You always get those two together. Characteristic names for Amorites, I guess. Sihon and Og. One king in Heshbon, one king in Bashan. But they're two Amorite kings. Let's see. I want to show you something that's interesting here. Let me see. I guess I'll put this up. Now, I'm just going to show you where it is on this map and then I'm going to put a map up there that's a little larger so you can see where it is. Because I want you to see where this city is. The city that's mentioned in the end of verse 1 of chapter 3, Edrei, because this is how far north they go in their fighting. Once they've gone around Moab, and here's Ammon, which would be the Ammonites here, and here's where they're going to fight Sihon, and all the way up here is where they're going to fight Og, who's king up in Bashan. So even though they're going to encamp right along here, and this is where the main camp is going to stay, they go all the way up to right here. Now you can't see it spelled, but you can at least see where I'm pointing. This is almost as far north to be level with the Sea of Galilee over here. And this is this little place called Edrei, and this is where they go up to battle. Now this is a map of King Saul's reign. Maybe you can see it a little bit larger, I don't know, but here's the place, Edrei. Still there even that much later. Now remember in chapter 2 in verse 25, God said, I'm going to put the fear and the dread of you upon all these other countries round about. But then look over in chapter 3 and verse 1. Now this concerns Og. He's the more important, by the way, of these two kings. Og is more important than Sihon. Then we turned and went up the way to Bashan. Now they've already defeated Sihon here. They went up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. Now it goes on to say there in verse 5, all these cities were fenced with high walls, gates, and bars, beside unwalled towns a great many. These chief cities that they are taking, it says that they all have high walls, gates, and bars. Now what's interesting here is that God had said there in chapter 2 and 25, he's going to put the fear and dread of Israel upon these people. Now these people here in Edrei happen to have a very well fortified city. Why don't they just stay in that city rather than go out and fight Israel when God had already said, I'm going to put a fear on you? So we can only assume that Og is very afraid of the Israelites. On the basis of 225, that's what we have to assume, that they are very afraid of the Israelites. Why do they go out and fight them and leave that well-fortified, protected city? Anyone know? There's a good reason why. What? Well, you're close. You're real close. Look in Joshua 24, and I'll show you why. Verse 11, first of all. And ye went over Jordan, and came unto Jericho. The men of Jericho fought against you, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I delivered them into your hand. Now he's talking about the reign and the rule of Joshua here. So we know this would be after the Deuteronomy account. But look at verse 12. And I sent the hornet before you, which drave them out from before you. Who? All those people mentioned in verse 11? No, even the 2 kings of the Amorites. God sent hornets into those cities and drove all of them out of the cities, and Israel slew all of them out in the field. You see, you wouldn't have known that without putting the passages together there. You put all that together, and of course you have to end up with what we ended up with. Terribly afraid of Israel. Verse 5, of course Moses is saying all this to make a point. We're back to Deuteronomy 3. High walls, gates, and bars. I wouldn't have left that town for anything. But if you've got hornets stinging you, there you go all out. And so they go out and get defeated. Verse 11 we'll just mention because it's an interesting one. Og is one of the remnant, or he's the only remnant of this particular race of giants. Now you see the word giant many times. Generally you just need the transliteration because you'll get confused on the different giants. This is the Rephaim. R-E-P-H-A-I-M. So you should scratch giants out. This is the Rephaim. That's not true of every time you see the word giant, though, just sometimes. The Rephaim, particular species of giant. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. So he says that he's the only one left of the Rephaim. We first see them in Genesis 14:5, by the way. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth thereof, after the cubit of a man. Now we all know that a bed generally is longer than a person, but to take these figures here, 9 cubits long, he has to be over 10 feet tall. So he's taller than Goliath, much taller than Goliath was. So this Og here is just, he'd make a good professional wrestler. 10 feet tall, I mean, some of them you see are like 6'7", and that's a big fella. But 10 feet tall, you're almost twice as tall as he is. And he could have been taller here. We don't know how much he had left over there in his bed. And this is his bed. Some people try to make it a sarcophagus, but this is his bed that's mentioned here. Now we go on down. Let's see, in verses 24 to 29, we have Moses' request to see the land. God tells him in verse 26, don't ever speak to me on this matter again. He says no. Moses wants to go into the promised land. Verse 26, he says, don't ever speak to me on this subject again. He didn't have that much time, just a few more weeks to live anyway. But he never brought it up after that. Then in chapter 4, we just have a very beautiful chapter on obedience to the Word of God, the election of Israel. We've got a warning against images and icons. We've got a warning against Bible translations. And we even have a prophecy of the latter days. So you've got just a lot of things there in Deuteronomy 4 that we dare not get into. We did get through those first 4 chapters. Start up with chapter 5 next time then. The second part on your outline, and we'll look at the heart of Deuteronomy and the legal discourse.